The joyful sounds of babies, laughing and splashing, bounced off the white-painted walls of the neat villas surrounding the clear blue water of a large private pool. I took another sip of my gin and tonic and watched as my adult son and his wife played happily with their 3-year-old boy in armbands and their 1.5-year-old daughter, who was floating in the water in a bright yellow swim ring. I looked at my beautiful wife, Jane, who was sitting opposite me at the table under the shade of a large umbrella, reading a book. Even after all these years, she was still very attractive. It was hard to think of her as a mother to an adult child and a grandmother, but then, I reflected, we started our family when we were still quite young. There are many benefits to starting a family early, as I now know very well. As if instinctively sensing that I was thinking about her, Jane looked up from her book and smiled at me. I responded with a smile, nodding towards the young family in front of us. She smiled indulgently and went back to reading as I watched the heartwarming scene a little longer, thinking how much it reminded me of the happy moments the two of us had in that same pool with our own child over 20 years ago. The game slowed down a bit, and Charlotte, our pregnant daughter-in-law, stood in the shallow water before taking her son Jack by the hand and leading him up the shallow steps to their sun loungers and the pile of towels lying there. As she began to gently wipe it away, I was reminded of how undeniably beautiful she was, especially now, when, as at this moment, her pregnancy was beginning to show. Although pregnancy can be a difficult time for many, some girls have it easy, I thought, and Charlotte was definitely one of the lucky ones. Her long, dark hair literally sparkled, her eyes sparkled, and her lightly tanned skin was fresh and clean. She was still moving gracefully, despite the swelling in her belly that was now becoming noticeable, and judging by her previous 2 pregnancies, she would continue to do so almost until the very end. It was ironic, I thought, considering it had taken her so long and so much misfortune to get pregnant. To me, the biological father of her 2 children and the unborn child in her belly, she seemed especially beautiful. But it was a secret that only she and I shared, and that we must take with us to the grave. Charlotte looked away for a moment, and I chuckled as her cheeky son rushed back to the pool. His mother playfully chased him, jumping after him in the grass, before scooping him up in her arms a few feet from the water and enthusiastically tickling him in mock punishment for his escape attempt. Once she was sure he was complying, she secretly adjusted her tiny clothes. I pretended not to notice. Satisfied with Jack, Charlotte dried herself off on another large blue towel, laid it out on the sun lounger and stretched out, generously rubbing herself and her son with sunscreen, while my son Adam played with little Emily some more. Apparently they were father and daughter. Everyone said so. She clearly had his facial features, which, since he and I are clearly father and son, should not be surprising. Indeed, this was one of the main reasons why Charlotte asked me 3 times to impregnate her. As I furtively watched, Charlotte rolled onto her side to watch Jack play with his toys. Lying on her stomach in her condition was now uncomfortable, if not impossible, and in doing so unknowingly rolled over her slender, feminine, barley-covered ass towards me and my wife. I glanced at Jane, whose eyes were still glued to the book, and then back at the slender, sexy figure in front of me. How many times have we made love? I closed my eyes and thought. It took nearly 3 months of lovemaking to conceive Jack. Barely 8 weeks for Emily, and even less for the baby growing inside her now. More than enough to leave pleasant memories for a lifetime. I lay down in the sun, closed my eyes, and remembered how it all started about 4 years ago. Charlotte and our only child, Adam, were happily married for over 10 years. Both high-profile graduates with research positions at the top university where they studied, met, and married, they initially focused on their careers. Over the years, I never had the right time, from a professional point of view, to start a family. They worked and studied very hard and achieved considerable academic success, but as with academia, the financial rewards were somewhat meager. Over time, however, the sound of their biological clock ticking became louder and louder until, at the age of 30, they finally began trying for a baby, After years of trying and no subsequent pregnancy, it became clear that something was definitely wrong. Charlotte was practically half of their relationship, and she had to do something to improve the situation, and after several heated conversations, Adam finally agreed that they both should go to the doctor. Long story short, they discovered that there was a problem, and the problem was Adam. Typical of our beloved only son, Adam's problem could not have been a low supply of materials that could have been solved quite simply. No, his situation turned out to be a complex problem involving a malfunction of his fluid, which he apparently produced in huge quantities, but which was largely unable to fertilize Charlotte's eggs. Natural conception was deemed extremely unlikely. So in their mid-30s, they began a series of complex IVF programs designed to select the best, most promising specimens and artificially assist them in the arduous task of fertilizing Charlotte's eggs. This involved taking powerful fertility drugs over long periods, which wreaked havoc with her hormones and led to frequent and more emotional arguments than ever before in their happy marriage. The first 2 rounds of IVF were paid for by the National Health Service, but after their failure, the couple were left alone with financial difficulties. IVF programs are extremely expensive, and Adam's problem meant that they required treatment at the high end of an already high price scale, but as they got older and more desperate to have a child, they spent more and more money on more and more number of rounds of IVF, until eventually all their savings were gone, along with most of the equity in their semi-detached Victorian home. Without hesitation, Jane and I loaned them enough money for 2 more programs, both predictably unsuccessful. But after that, we also had no savings left, except for my modest pension fund. Charlotte's parents were unable to help at all. Her father had died several years earlier, leaving her mother with a comfortable widow's pension, but no money to spare. There was nothing left to do but save. After a year of frugal living and selling Charlotte's car and mortgaging the last of the equity in their home, they were finally able to afford a 7th round of IVF using a newly developed technique. At first, to our surprise, it seemed to be successful. Charlotte even said she felt different on the inside. Her hair was shiny, and for a few blissful weeks, we all began to believe that they might finally conceive, although none of us dared say it out loud, as if for fear of tempting fate. However, we all started making secret plans in case there was a baby in the house. Having money meant DIY renovations were much needed, and I took some time off from my job as a builder to help renovate and decorate their poorly maintained home. The exterior woodwork alone would require a good 2 weeks of work, which meant I would be at their house quite a lot. Adam and Charlotte were still working full-time, so I was left on my own, which I honestly prefer. I can concentrate better and work faster if I am not disturbed. It took 3 full days to repair the worst of the damage that years of neglect and lack of money had caused. And I was ready to begin the long process of painting the results of my labor when I heard an unexpected sound from the kitchen. Believing that I was alone in the house, at first I suspected a thief. But as I descended the stairs and cautiously approached the kitchen window, I saw my beautiful daughter-in-law, Charlotte, sitting at the kitchen table with a bloody rag in her hands, her shoulders shaking from the silent sobs. Quietly opening the door, I slowly entered the room. Charlotte didn't even acknowledge my presence. She just continued to cry, twisting the rag in her fingers. Charlie, what happened?" I asked quietly, pulling up a chair, placing one hand on her forearm and wrapping my other arm around her shoulders. She made a few muffled noises, as if unable to speak, so I just hugged her tightly in silence. At first, this only seemed to make the situation worse. Her sobs became louder, and big, salty tears ran down her cheeks and onto mine. But eventually, she began to come to her senses a little and regained some of her ability to speak. "Can you tell me now?" I asked, when she seemed calm enough to answer. She said through sobs, "I lost my baby." It took me a few seconds to understand the real meaning of her words. This meant that their 7th round of IVF treatment, the one we all hoped and prayed would be successful, failed, just like all the previous ones. She wasn't pregnant. Again. All our savings are gone, and we borrowed all this money from you, she said. I put my arm around her shoulders again and pulled her close to me. You know Jane and I don't expect that money back, right? I said, trying to calm her down. We know how important this is to both of you. It's important to us too. Adam is our only child, and we want to see you happy. But we can't just keep wasting money, she continued, her voice breaking from tears. We should have a decent home for our family, not live in this shack and spend every last penny on damn IVF. I stood up and took a tall glass from the cabinet, filling it with cold water before placing it on the table in front of her. She took it and drank half of it in one gulp. Thank you, Tony, she said, her voice much more controlled now. I just felt so alone. You are not alone, I assured her quietly. You know we're always here if you need help. And don't think we'll always tell Adam everything you tell us. You're our daughter now. I just can't bear the thought of telling him, she said. This is the end, isn't it? There's nowhere else to go, and there's no more money. I stroked her cheek soothingly as she continued talking. But he'll still want to keep trying, she sobbed. He'll ruin us. I can't let that happen. But I can't ruin his dreams either, can I? I love him too much. What should I do? Then don't tell him, I said. At least for now. What? She asked, raising her head for the first time. Go wash up. I'll make some tea and we'll discuss everything now, before Adam gets home. 15 minutes later, we were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking steaming hot tea. Charlotte looked much better. Her makeup-free face was pale, pink, and puffy, but improving as she watched. I'm sorry I was so hysterical, she said. I brushed the thought aside. It's only natural. I'm so sorry for both of you, I replied. She smiled sadly. Can you talk now? Her eyes were still a little teary, but she nodded. Let's try to look at this logically, I suggested, appealing to the common sense of the girl I knew. She nodded again. Did the doctors talk about alternatives? I asked. If you really don't succeed? Yes. Let's look at them one by one. She took a deep breath, then nodded again. Well, shall we start with IVF? I suggested. I can't, Tony, not again. Money aside, I just can't go through all of this again, only to have our hopes dashed again. And these fertility drugs are making me, well, we have terrible fights when I take them, I accept. She thought about it. And even if we had money, I couldn't waste it again. We need to move on with our lives, even if it means living without children. Have you thought about adoption? We discussed it, she replied, gradually calming down, as I had hoped. But it won't be our child in the same sense, will it? She looked puzzled. I know it's terrible to say, but neither of us were happy, and it's taking so long. Well, what other options are there? You know better than me what the doctors told you. She thought seriously. I suppose the only realistic way would be to use a donor. But this is also a problem. Firstly, with the advent of new rules, there is a shortage of donors, and it costs twice as much as regular IVF. And even if it works, the child will most likely look like his biological father and not like Adam. She paused to catch her breath. He or she may even want to find his real father when he grows up. I've seen the TV shows. She stopped, trying to hold back her tears. I can't ask Adam to raise a child who will remind him every day that he failed to create his own. She started crying again. I wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders and held her close until the worst of the sobs passed. My heart ached for her, for both of them. I just don't know how to tell Adam when he's coming home tonight, she said, her voice choking. I just don't know. I'm scared of how he'll react to this. Do you want me, or Jane, to be here, or both? Moral support? I suggested. Charlotte seemed to find a little extra inner strength as she wiped her eyes and steeled herself in front of me. Thanks, Tony, but I think this is something we have to handle on our own. Just the two of us. I felt a little better. At least her last words showed that she had regained some control over herself. It's time to decide what we're going to do with our lives. We can't keep living like this. It was more like the Charlotte I knew and loved. I understand, Charlie, but remember, I'm here if you need help. Both of us. It may not seem like it, but you're never alone. Never. The next morning, I approached the house with a feeling of anxiety. I told Jane the bad news last night, and it took all my conviction not to let her call Adam right away. It was a matter between him and Charlotte, which they had to decide together, in their own time and alone. What would it be like, I asked, if she burst into tears on the phone to Adam before Charlotte could tell him the news herself? Jane had a hard time overcoming her maternal instincts towards both of them, but she eventually agreed. When I went to the house the next morning, I could see for myself. So, with low expectations and a heavy heart, I knocked on the kitchen door at 8 the next morning. Adam's car was not in its usual place, which meant he had left for work. This should have been a good sign. The door opened slowly. This could be a bad sign. Charlotte finally opened the door and made way for me as I carried the box of brushes and paint into the kitchen. She was fully dressed in leggings and a loose t-shirt, which I took as a good sign too. At least she wasn't too depressed to take care of herself. Indeed, when she greeted me, I saw little desperation in her. No, she looked like someone who was in control of the situation. Not at all what I expected. "How do you feel today?" I asked, hoping for a sympathetic look on my face. "I'm fine," she sighed. "The pain wasn't bad. I felt sick all day, but it could have been nerves. I still don't know how I managed to tell Adam without completely breaking down." "How did you cope?" I asked, concerned. "How did it go?" "That didn't go well," she said, pouring hot water into 2 mugs and adding a tea bag. "In fact, it was worse than I expected." She handed me the floating mug and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. "He looked like the world had fallen on his shoulders," she continued. "I didn't realize how hopeful he was that things would work out this time." Her voice became more excited. "I tried to warn him, we all did, that you can't be sure until at least 12 weeks have passed. But—" She broke off, but her expression said it all. "Where is he now?" I asked. "He went to work," she replied, "although how he'll be able to concentrate I can't imagine." She turned to me. "Tony, I've never seen him so weird. Last night he was devastated, like the center of his world had collapsed. Today he's manic, keeps talking about another IVF and looking for new treatments. He's even talking about America." She paused and her face became serious. "Can I be honest with you?" she asked. "Certainly. I think he's afraid that I'll end up leaving him because he can't give me a child." My eyebrows must have jumped up in silence. "This is complete nonsense. Nonsense," she continued. "I love him so much. He is obsessed with the idea of having children, not me. Of course, I would like to have them too, but I need him. I want to be with him, with or without children." Tears appeared in her eyes again, but she didn't seem to notice. "I tried to get him to understand it, but he has this idea stuck in his head. I can't let this happen, Tony. I just can't. He'll ruin us, create more expectations and disappointments, and then what will happen?" I was about to put my arm around her shoulders, but she moved away a little, took a deep breath, and straightened up, as if preparing for a difficult task. I was amazed. I had always known that she was a strong, albeit quiet person, more than a match for our son's confidence. But when she spoke, her words completely surprised me. "I made a decision. It's a big decision. I stayed up almost all night thinking about it and waiting for you to come. I could believe it." She looked exhausted, and I wondered what she was going to say. When she spoke, it was almost like she had learned speech, clear and precise, but I noticed that she couldn't look me in the eyes. "I can't risk losing the person I love, but I know there's only one thing that can make him happy," she said. "We need to have a baby. We don't have the money for another IVF, even with your generous help, and it probably won't work anyway. Adoption won't make us happy." She took a deep breath and spoke quickly, as if desperately trying to get the words out. "I just have to get pregnant. There's no alternative. I'll have to use a donor, and I want it to be you." With these words, she leaned back in her chair and looked me straight in the eyes. I sat back too, stunned, trying to make sense of what my sister-in-law had just told me. I managed, feeling stupid. "Wow, Charlie. This is shocking." She was silent, clearly waiting for me to say something meaningful. "Do you want me to help you get pregnant?" "Yes, Tony, that's right. It would be the most wonderful gift you could give us both, although I don't want Adam to ever find out." "God!" I said again, still in shock, trying to wrap my head around the whole idea. "There are a couple of problems, however," Charlotte continued, this time looking closely at my face. "Only a couple?" I joked. My head was spinning. "If we use the lab, there will be records. Legal records. Donor-conceived children have rights, including the right to find their genetic father when they grow up. We will never be able to hide that fact from Adam or Jane." "I see," I said. "What's the other little problem?" "Using a donor through IVF is very expensive. I mean, really expensive." I sighed. Money problem again. "We don't have any money left to pay for this, so there's only one solution." She took another deep breath. "I want us to do this, naturally." My mouth dropped open in surprise. Did I really get it right? I was speechless. "You mean, you want me, I want you to have sex with me, Tony, and keep having sex with me until I get pregnant." An hour later, we were still sitting in the kitchen, drinking strong black coffee from small cups, both of us needing a stimulant. The initial shock had somewhat worn off, and I now felt helpless in the face of the magnitude of the plans my sister-in-law had made during the night and which she had enthusiastically laid out to me. I felt dizzy. The whole situation seemed completely unreal, and I was still only processing part of what she was telling me. And I've been on fertility drugs so often that I know exactly when my most fertile period is. We'll need to do this every day, twice a day when I'm ovulating. Then I'll have to lie down for an hour. Maximize my chances. Maybe it won't take much time. Make us both so happy. Please tell me that you'll at least think about it." Eventually she stopped talking and I tried to understand it all. Honestly, without the very obvious and very big problem of me having sex with my son's wife repeatedly, it all made very clear, logical sense. My DNA was undoubtedly very close to Adam's. Although Charlotte was close to me as a daughter, she was not actually a blood relative, so there was no need to worry about possible birth defects. And if only the two of us ever knew, there would be no problem with secrecy. "Where would we meet to do this?" I asked. "Here," she answered immediately. "Where is better? You're going to be here alone for a few weeks, working around the house. We're so grateful for that. You know that, don't you? I'm only working part-time this semester to recover from my miscarriage. No one has any reason to suspect anything." "What would you do with Adam?" I asked with concern. "If you got pregnant, he would have to believe it was his." I thought about that too. She said, "Tomorrow I have an appointment with a specialist. I will tell Adam that I was asked if we would take part in a clinical trial for some new specialty fertility drugs. I will say that they are not participating. It's not properly approved yet, but the doctors feel so sorry for us that they would like to give us a chance to at least try. For free. So you will continue trying with him at the same time?" "I have to, otherwise he won't believe it's his child. But if you do this to him the same way you did to me, he'll notice. If we do this twice a day, sorry." Charlotte seemed to think for a minute. "Everything is fine. I'll just tell him that one of the side effects of the drugs is that they cause a little inflammation." She was laughing. "I'll probably still be upset if we do this as long as I think we need to." I had to admit that the plan actually worked. "So, what would you actually take?" "High dosage of folic acid," she answered immediately. "Either way, it's a good thing and it comes in packages with little to no labeling, so it could be anything." "You really thought of everything." I said I was impressed. And of course, there would be no complications between us, like falling in love with each other and a ruined marriage. It would just be fertilization. If we agree to do this, when do you want to start? I asked quietly. The sooner we start, the sooner I can get pregnant. She laughed, but I realized she was at least half serious. But realistically, after a miscarriage, I'll probably become fertile quickly. My body will sort of compensate for the loss, so the sooner the better. I need to think about this, Charlie. Can you give me 24 hours? Of course, and I'll still love you if you say no. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it. But I really hope you agree. You could save our marriage, our financial future, and our happiness. She paused, and then her face blossomed into a wonderfully mischievous smile, along with a bright red blush. And to be honest, you might even enjoy the process too. How often in life are you offered something like this? After making the decision and convincing myself that it was for the right reasons, I slept more peacefully that night, but was still not without anxiety. I had reassured my conscience regarding the betrayal of my wife and son, but a whole new set of concerns arose in my mind. I haven't had sex with anyone other than my wife in almost 30 years. We still had a pretty active sex life, so I knew I didn't have any major problems in that department. But what if my nerves got the better of me in Charlotte's presence, and I couldn't cope? Eventually, however, I fell asleep, waking up 5 minutes before the alarm was supposed to go off. I made tea for Jane and myself, then showered, shaved, and got dressed for work. I took special care to maintain the limited amount of hair on my face and body to ensure I looked as presentable as possible. Jane isn't much of a morning person, so she didn't notice my extra effort. But it was still a relief when 7:30 arrived and I got into my truck, loaded with tools, and drove across town, pulling into Adam and Charlotte's driveway right when the radio announced that it was 8 o'clock. I slowly climbed out of the cabin and walked to the kitchen door, where I knocked nervously. There was a rustling sound from inside, and the door opened hesitantly. In the relative darkness of the kitchen, Charlotte looked younger and more innocent than ever. Dressed in a fluffy white robe, she smelled of sweet bath oil. Her hair was brushed to a shine, and she wore no makeup. For at least 10 years, it seemed as if they had fallen away from it. "Hi, Tony," she said, her voice sounding nervous. "Hey, Charlie," I replied with equal hesitation, entering the house and following her into the small room. I watched silently as she prepared our usual tea and we sat, carefully sipping it. Finally, I felt I had to ask to make sure I wasn't about to make a terrible mistake. "Are you still sure you want to do this?" To my surprise, my voice wavered. In response, she nodded categorically. "As long as you're okay with the idea and all the consequences." I've been thinking about this since our conversation the evening before. I could live with it as long as it stayed our secret and made them both happy. "How do you want to, do this?" I whispered. She blushed. I thought we'd go to the guest room and... If you need a shower, I'll wait for you." Her voice was shaking. "Okay, Charlie, whatever you say. It's entirely your decision, and if you change your mind..." I left the sentence unfinished. We quickly and silently finished our tea. 2 minutes later, I was in the shower for the second time in an hour, feeling the hot water on my skin. I looked at my body. Not too bad for a man in the late 50s, I thought with a grin. Probably the result of physical labor. I was already half excited. Thank God this shouldn't have been a problem today, I thought, silently grateful for it. After a minute or two, I turned off the shower and stepped out of the stall, drying myself off with the towel that Charlotte had apparently left for my use. Fresh new towel, fresh new robe. It's clear that Charlotte has decided to point to a new beginning. I wrapped a towel around my waist and walked out onto the landing. The door to the guest room was slightly open. To my surprise, everything inside was illuminated by bright sunlight. And for a minute I thought that Charlotte had changed her mind and stayed downstairs. But when I entered the room, I saw her robe neatly folded on the chair. She was naked. I inhaled sharply, and she smiled shyly. I felt my arousal tighten against the towel around my waist. Is this really happening? Isn't this all a dream? I remembered what we had said to each other the evening before. This is not cheating, this is just fertilization. We'll make it as clinical as possible. We won't even kiss. That doesn't mean we're going to fall in love, does it? Adam will be so happy. This is what he wants most in his life. The entire process from start to finish took less than 10 minutes. Our eyes met, and all four of us were in tears. Is this what you wanted? I asked quietly, my voice trembling. Charlotte smiled and nodded, a look of relief appearing on her face. Now it's too late to change your mind. I rolled onto my back and lay down next to her on the bed. I have to stay like this for another hour. She giggled. I'm glad that only you can see me. It's a good thing neither of us have to go to work yet, I said. Really? She replied. 15 minutes later, I returned to the bedroom, already dressed, to find her asleep, her knees still tightly pressed together and raised on a pile of pillows. I went downstairs and got to work. About an hour later, I heard the front door open and looked down the stairs. Charlotte, now fully dressed in jeans and a loose sweater, was coming around the corner of the house with another large mug of tea in her hand. I happily went downstairs to meet her. This is wonderful, thank you, I said, taking the floating mug from her hands. Are you feeling good? Still no regrets? Charlotte looked a little embarrassed, but only a little. I'm happier than I've been in a long time, and relieved now that it's all started. Her smile was a mixture of innocence and guilt, and it melted my heart. Are you going out? I asked, noticing the bag over my shoulder. Yes. I need to go to work to make copies and then to the supermarket. She smiled suggestively. Don't worry, I'll be back in about an hour for our meeting. I'm determined now. See you later. Thanks for the tea, I replied, sipping the hot drink as she walked away to her car and drove down the road. She returned at noon, smiled at me, and went into the house. I half expected her to change her mind and resigned myself to the fact that I would only have one wonderful memory of making love to my beautiful sister-in-law. But I underestimated Charlotte's determination. Half an hour later, she came out the back door and asked if I was ready. I didn't need to be told twice. Following her into the house and upstairs, I took a shower, and the whole incredible process was repeated, this time with much less embarrassment for both of us. For the next 2 weeks, we made love every day, often twice, except on Sundays, when my son was around all day. Every few days, Charlotte took a home pregnancy test to see if she was already pregnant, which happened far more often than necessary. But like I said, she's a determined girl, with no luck. For over 2 months, we had sex every day for 3 out of 4 weeks, and Charlotte always hoped that her period wouldn't ruin the 4th. It's no surprise that she and I became even closer than before. On the second Thursday of the 3rd month, I arrived at 8 in the morning, ready and eager to perform. But as I approached the back door, it was thrown open, and a half-mad, half-dressed Charlotte rushed out and threw her arms around my neck. Look, Tony, look! She muttered something, her words overlapping each other. She shoved something long white in my face, too close for me to see it properly. I chuckled and took it from her hand. It was one of her home test kits, but this time the message in the small window was clear and unambiguous. Pregnant. I was stunned. After all the tears, all the years of trying and tens of thousands of pounds spent on IVF, all it took was 2 months of blissful, amazing, heartwarming sex with one of the most beautiful creatures I've ever encountered to bring happiness on such an epic scale. I took her hand and carefully led her into the kitchen, her feet seemingly barely touching the floor. Her hair was disheveled, her dress was only half-buttoned, and I held her in my arms for a long time, while tears of joy began to roll down her cheeks. "Thank you," she sobbed. "I can't tell you how much this means, how grateful I am. but I reassured her. "We still have a long way to go," I whispered, "before you can tell the world. But this is really very good news. I would open a bottle of champagne if it didn't give away our secret." She giggled. "Anyway, I can't drink anything now. I won't take any chances with this child." She pressed her hand to her flat stomach, her face now shining despite her tears of joy. She kissed me on the cheek. "You're amazing, Tony. Remember this." She danced on the kitchen floor like a 10-year-old girl, screaming in a sing-song voice, "I will have a baby! I will have a baby! I will have a baby!" Then, as if an unwanted thought had entered her mind, she suddenly became more serious. "I believe our daily sessions have now served their purpose." This thought obviously also occurred to me. It was a bittersweet moment. "I think I'll miss them. It was great while it lasted," I thought. "But we have always strived for this. This is a really great result." I paused. She looked at me. I looked at her. Charlotte smiled her sweetest smile and took my hand. "Maybe we can try again? Some kind of holiday?" I blushed as she led me upstairs. This time, slowly and tenderly, making love to the beautiful young woman who was now truly carrying my child. Charlotte's pregnancy did not go smoothly due to terrible morning sickness and high blood pressure, but it lasted a full 9 months. When she felt confident enough to go public with the news 12 weeks later, our son Adam was absolutely over the moon and sounded almost drunk with pure joy as he called me and his mother early that morning, accompanied by his mother, Charlotte, and then most of the contents of his address book. "This is incredible, Dad. After everything we've been through, for it to happen naturally, like this." In the face of such obvious happiness, my last painful doubts immediately disappeared. Eventually, as you know from the beginning of this story, Charlotte gave birth to a boy. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a good healthy weight, in just 8 hours of blissful labor. He looks like me, and his genetic father, and his father Adam, and that's perfect. They finally became a real family. The next year, to my amazement, Charlotte asked me if we could repeat the process. She and Adam wanted to have a big family before they were too old to enjoy it, and hoped the same fertility drugs would work the second time around. After thinking about it all night, I called my sister-in-law the next morning. After all, the inside of their house still needed a lot of work, didn't it? Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.